Okay, guys, we're moving right along into section 1.5, linguistic discrimination. And here we're going to continue this conversation of what is proper or good English and what is non-standard English. I want to preface this all with, even though we're discussing English, these concepts apply to all languages. So even though there's a standard American English, there's also a standard Hindu and or a Hindi language. There's a standard Australian. There's a standard British. There in Britain, there are multiple British dialects, and one is considered more proper than the other. So even though we're looking at all this through the lens of English, just know these concepts apply to every language. So we've talked about proper English or standard English and why people speak that way. We're going to explore that some more, but we also want to explore this idea that sometimes we choose to speak a non-standard or a non-proper dialect for a specific reason. We do choose to do that, and we're proud to do it, and there are circumstances in which we will do it. And then we ask the question, who chooses to speak these non-standard ways? Are they the rich people or poor people? Are they rural versus urban? And what's motivating the reason they don't speak standard? And then do other people in their groups also speak like them? So these are setting up for the topics we're going to explore here in this lecture. Let's touch back on online work 2, which you just finished before you got to this lecture right here. And the whole point of that was to exercise the fact that standard American English might be different than the dialect you actually have innately, the grammars you have innately taken on based on the dialect that you speak. And also, we have to clarify that our verbal literacies are sometimes different than our written literacies. Okay, so some of those sentences that were wrong maybe sounded okay when you would listen to them, but in writing it was wrong. It looked wrong. So the literacy that's acceptable in a written format is very different than the literacy that might be acceptable in an oral format. So when we say the word context, so sometimes we know it is an unacceptable for formal context, but acceptable for informal, meaning some of those things didn't sound like proper English, some of those errors, right? But they would completely work in informal context with a friend. So we use the example of she don't know him as an example of something that might be appropriate in an informal context, like you're just talking with your girlfriends. In higher ed, when we use the word context, we basically mean environment, okay? There's some environments where we talk this way and some environments where we talk this way. You'll hear the word context probably used in lots of classes, but you can substitute a synonym for that word would be environment. So the question becomes, how do we navigate between our different contexts, between our different linguistic contexts, our different language environments? How are we shifting how we speak so we can blend in when we need to blend in at the right time and right place? Okay. I love this concept because, or I love this clip. You guys probably know these guys. They do a great job of demonstrating to you what I'm talking about when I'm talking about shifting our language between contexts. So go ahead and take a look. So if we were in class together, I would ask you, what kind of shifts did you observe? Like what kind of linguistic habits did they change throughout this video to match the context they were in? And it's usually a funny conversation because we've got the guy being romantic with his wife on the phone. The moment the other guy enters the scene, he starts maybe sounding a little more tough. And then when the other guy leaves the scene, he maybe sounds a little more flamboyant, right? So we see these different shifts. And it's a beautiful video from a sociolinguistic standpoint because, these comedians play on the fact that they're Black, or I believe Key is also Black and white. So they play on how these racial or ethnic features about them situate their language choices. And they're not linguists, right? They don't maybe know exactly what they're playing on, but they totally are clued in on how language is a powerful indicator of your social group and your social standing. So I love this video for that. Just as those comedians shifted their style, you also shift yours. And that's because you wear many different hats. Maybe one hat is that you are going to be a future teacher. The other is that maybe you're a parent. or an aunt or an uncle, right? The other is that maybe you're African American or you're Caucasian or you're Hispanic. Think of all these different hats you wear. I want you to think about those for yourself as you're watching this video, because all those hats, depending on which ones you're wearing and which ones you're taking off, are reasons that you change the way you speak. So think of these hats as groups you belong to. Think of them as your social roles. They could also be like, one hat you live in is, or that you have is that you're a Texan, right? The argument here is that you develop behavioral and linguistic habits because of these hats, because of these groups that you belong to. Okay, and just as we saw in that Key and Peele video, they were putting on different hats depending on what the context was in that given second. So again, we're asking the question is, how do we navigate between these various contexts? What hat do we know to put on when, and why do we know how to put that on? Here's some terms that we've already reviewed in the prior lectures: regional dialects, standard American English, language attitudes, and a word we've used a little bit, lexicon. So that's your mental dictionary of words. That's all the grammars that's in your head that maybe you can't articulate, but you're still following them. That's called your lexicon. Here's terms that we're going to explore today. There's quite a few of them. Take notes if you need to. Again, we don't have a quiz on sociolinguistics in this class, but a lot of this content does appear on the Texas exams as well as in our final. So definitely pay attention. You can always come back to these videos later in the semester. If you have time, I invite you to stop and take this regional dialect survey. It's super awesome. You can go to the PowerPoint, click on this link, but through a series of questions, it will actually get a pretty accurate guess of where they think you live and what dialect of English that you speak. A quick note on it, if you get, most of you will probably get some sort of Southern, if you're a native speaker of English grown up in Texas, you'll get some sort of Southern dialect, but you also might notice that you use features from a different dialect in the United States. So I would ask you, if I had the chance, where did your parents grow up? Where did your grandparents grow up? It's possible you've been exposed through long-term relationships with people that grew up in a different dialect, and you've taken on some of those features. So what is the difference between a language and a dialect? Ultimately, this is a loaded question because they're one and the same. Okay, so they all dialects follow rules, all languages follow rules. But one of the main differences is that people that speak different dialects can often still successfully communicate with each other, right? You might not understand everything someone from New York says, but you can understand a majority of it and still have likely a successful conversation with that person. Versus if you're speaking English and you're talking to someone who speaks the language of Cantonese, there's probably, unless you spoke Cantonese, there's no successful communication that's going to occur, right? So the difference between a dialect and the language is that people that speak different dialects likely can still successfully communicate with each other. So standard American English, we've talked about it. And what is it? Where is it spoken? Who uses it? That we know it's a trick question because we know no one naturally knows it. Everyone teaches themselves, or everyone learns what standard is. And it's a loaded question, right? What is it and where is it spoken? The question then we want to follow up with is, if we're all exposed to standard American English, then why don't we all just speak it anyways, right? Why ever use any of the other dialects that you have in your lexicon? Because you know standard American English and you know that it's seen as prestigious. So why not just use that? Why ever use the other features? And we're going to talk about that answer in a second, but we also want to talk about why doesn't everyone just speak the same? We're all exposed to standard American English, right? But so why don't we all naturally speak the same? If I'm watching a bunch of media and the politicians campaigning and all the news anchors, and I'm hearing them use the standard American English, why aren't I not just continuing to use that? Why do I have any different lexical features than them? Well, one of the answers for that is because we have regional dialects, right? So based on where you live, there's a dialect that you're picking up on because of where you geographically live. We have your sociolect, so that's the social groups you belong to. And we also have what's called an idiolect, which we'll get to in a second. Your regional dialects versus sociolects. So remember, regional dialects are geographically constrained, like locations on a map, okay? And sociolects, they're not geographically constrained. They're just different hats you wear, right? So there are some, like us females here in Texas are going to have some linguistic habits that are similar to a female in Alaska. And that's not, and we have different regional dialects, yes, but there are some similarities between us because we're all female. Same with the men. So that's some of the differences there between socio and regional. So sociolects, we've talked a little bit about. These are the hats you're wearing, your gender, your age, your occupation, your education. All of these will influence the way you speak. We can look at it very simply with education. So those of you in this class, you now know what what sociolect means. You understand that word. I just taught you that word. You understand it maybe a little bit even. Everyone who has never taken this class or a linguistics class at all doesn't know that word. So now you have a word in your lexicon that doesn't exist in the majority of the population's lexicon. Okay, so just right there is one small demonstration of how you are already different than other people just because of one class you're taking in your education. So imagine looking at those microscopic differences across all these social groups, and you can see where people become really unique. A question I'd love to talk about in class, it's always kind of a heated one, is what type of language attitudes exist regarding these social groups, right? So we could easily start with men and women. Okay, so what kind of language attitudes do people have about the way females speak? Okay, usually they say we talk really fast, high-pitched. What else would they say about us? Quite a few things. You're probably thinking of a couple right now. And so there are attitudes even amongst these social groups. Those language attitudes don't just exist regarding regional dialects. We have them with our sociolects too, right? So, and I will tell you that a lot of people think that women talk a lot. The studies they've done on this actually don't always show that. Men are quite talkative as well. So we have all these fake beliefs because of these language attitudes. So why aren't we all the same? Yeah, so as linguists, we like to study the patterns of groups. I want to study the pattern of Southern speakers or rural speakers. I want to study the linguistic patterns of females or African American females or African American males or Hispanics versus the African American community, right? I want to look at all these patterns that emerge. And basically what we as linguists find is there's certain tendencies. If you are a Hispanic female living in Texas, you probably have certain linguistic tendencies that a Hispanic female living in Alaska, if there are any, wouldn't have. So now we know, though, not all of you are going to conform to these tendencies. Okay, I know that. We all know that. We're all still uniquely different. So this is the reason no two individuals are alike, and that's because of your idiolect. Your speech style combined with your lexicon, so your mental dictionary, and the speech communities you belong to, all the social groups you belong to, create a really unique you called your idiolect, okay? You have no similarities to any other one person in the world. And you can look at siblings, for example. You guys grew up in the same regional dialect, maybe the same social groups, and yet you're still linguistically very different because we all have our own experiences that help form our own idiolect. So I just put these up here as an example, but here are demographics of maybe 4 different people in the world, and some of them each share the same thing, and they all have one thing different. And if you had these 4 people in a room together, they would not sound identical because they have their own little, whether it's their career differences or their age, that are going to influence a little linguistic variability that the other person doesn't have. And so we would ask the question, when do these people use standard American English? They have a lot of influence in their sociolects and their regional dialects. So when are these people going to use standard American English? When is a fitting time for you to use standard American English? So we can transition to that through that question with this information. Hanging with your friends. Are you going to use standard American English when you're hanging with your friends? Are you going to use standard American English when you're at work or at a job interview? Are you going to use standard American English if you're a customer service representative and you're interacting with a customer? Are you going to use standard American English at a college party? The reality is that you would use it in some of these circumstances and you might not use it in others. So we want to discuss what's motivating that. You have various social roles. You know, think about it. When you're hanging out with your friends, you're wearing the hat of being a friend. When you're at work, you're an employee. When you're at school, you're a student. So these are all hats you're wearing that are all guiding whether or not what type of language you're going to use in those contexts. So we talk about your idiolect, and I like to talk about the stovetop burner, right? So each of you in this class has your own stovetop burner, and it's got more than 4, right? It's got a burner for everything about you: your age, your ethnicity, your gender. You've got a standard American English burner. You've got your regional dialect burner, and depending on where you're at, you decide what burners you want to turn on and which ones you want to turn off. For example, with age, I'm probably younger than some of the other professors you have. And that's something that I get a little self-conscious on, right? So with age, there's wisdom is a conception we have. So I try to turn down my age when I'm trying to have academic conversations. I don't want to be stigmatized by my age or my gender, and I'll turn up my standard American English burner to look less stigmatized in those areas. So we're making all these choices. Imagine everything about you is just this stovetop burner, and you're constantly navigating and changing those dials based on how you want to be perceived. So what do I need to turn up or turn down to get respect or admiration? That's what you're thinking. You're not naturally thinking that when you're talking to someone. You're not thinking, how can I get this person to admire me? But you are instinctively, as a human being, going that direction. What can I do to get respect or admiration in this context? Which burners do I need on or off to do that? So there's words, there's terms for what we're describing here, and that's called covert and overt prestige. Prestige means to get respect or admiration, right? Okay, so those are the underlying human motivations behind language. We want respect and admiration. So I'm going to make choices so I can get that. Let's dive into what overt means and covert means, right? We're linguists, so we dissect words. We dissected prescriptivism and descriptivism, right? Prescriptive means prescribe. Descriptive means describe. We're dissecting the word to find meaning. Let's do that with overt and covert as well, because some of these terms are hard to memorize naturally. Overt means openly. So if I'm using overt prestige, I'm using an open form of something to get respect or admiration. Covert means not openly. So if I'm using covert prestige, I'm using a not open something to get respect or admiration. And that will make a little sense when I apply it to language. So let's start with overt prestige. Overt prestige is something you practice when you're trying to get respect or admiration. And specifically, overt means open, right? So you're using an openly known dialect that is understood by mainstream America to get respect or admiration. We're using American English again as our foundation for all of this, but again, this applies to every language, okay? So we're talking about America, we're talking about English, but this can be multiple languages we're talking about, multiple countries even. So if I'm going to practice overt prestige, I'm going to use a dialect that's openly known by mainstream English speakers so they can respect me or see me, right? So what kind of dialect might this be? What would be a dialect that's understood by mainstream America? And the answer would be typically a type of standard American English, right? We're going to use an openly known dialect, so something maybe educated, following the rules, so that we can get that respect or admiration. So the question is, when would you ever use overt prestige? When would you practice that? What's going to motivate you to turn up the overt prestige or the standard American dialect, right? Standard American English dialect. And some of the easiest quick grab answers are typically job interviews, right? Or your college writing assignments, maybe even in the college classroom, depending on the professor, you might practice a very standard, careful English, right? To get respect or to be seen as educated. There are places and times that you're going to use standard American English, and you're going to switch that burner on because it's not always on. We're going to talk about what other things that are on in a second. To switch to the standard American English style to practice this overt prestige so people can respect you and admire you. And if you remember, the standard American English game is kind of a dirty one. One of the reasons we use it is so people don't stigmatize us. The same way I don't like being stigmatized as a cheerleader or a kindergarten teacher, I will practice overt prestige to try to escape those stigmatizations. Covert prestige, on the other hand, so remember, covert means not openly. So if overt prestige means using an openly known dialect, then covert prestige must mean the opposite, using a not openly known dialect to get respect or admiration. So what dialect or dialects might that be? So anything that is not standard American English, okay? And then the question becomes, well, so using any of these other dialects we're talking about, Southern English or African American Vernacular English, I mean, you're telling me there's a time and place I'm going to use those, and how is that going to be useful to me? Why is it valuable? Why is it important? So the reality is that I love this meme. Saying I'm from Texas is low key a flex. Yeah, the reality is that sometimes the dialects, the really unique speech communities you belong to, are going to get you respect. Here's a couple examples. Okay, you're new to UNT Dallas. You're meeting a ton of other freshmen, or whether you're a transfer, you're coming in, you're new. Here's a student population that's roughly your age. How are you going to fit in? Sometimes that might be standard American English, but I'm guessing based on the demographics of our university, the age demographics, the gender, the ethnicity, that you're probably going to use other dialect types to fit in with your peers, okay? Because we use covert prestige, not openly known dialects, to find membership to groups, okay? We're all about group membership. And there aren't very many groups who speak standard American English. There are a ton of groups who use all these little language features that we picked up along the way. And if I want that respect or admiration from this group, I need to speak like them. Okay, and so whatever dialect they're using, I want to try to match that so I can be seen as an in member instead of an out member. I'll give you another example. If any of you have ever gone up north or out of the country, I don't have a Texas accent because I'm not really from Texas, but I know that when I leave the state, I should use the word y'all because people find it freaking adorable. Okay, people in other countries or in other regions speaking other dialects love the word y'all. The Southern accent, while we saw in those videos, is usually seen as kind of people regarded as uneducated or dumb sounding. They also think it's very pleasant and polite. You know, yes ma'am, no sir, y'all, that type of thing. And so it's almost, that's why I like this meme, saying from Texas is low-key a flex. People are like, oh, where are you from? They're drawn to that, right? If you ever met someone with an accent, do you just want to ask, where are you from? Tell me more about it. Because there's something prestigious about being unique. So it's nice to go up to New York and say y'all, and people find interest in you because you're using this covert prestige, and they find it really unique and charming. So there are reasons we practice covert prestige. It is primarily driven by out of wanting to be viewed as unique or being viewed and you want the stigmatations of that dialect, right? So if Southern dialect is seen as charming, you want to be viewed as charming, then you're going to use it a lot when you leave the state. Or you want to be friends with a certain group, and that's how they're using this slang or this terminology, and you want to be seen as someone who fits in, then you're going to practice covert prestige. I'm not going to play this video, but I love it because it plays on that Bostonian dialect. This was a Super Bowl commercial that came out, I think, well, it must have been earlier this year. But it's super funny because you can hear them play, these actors, who none of them are Boston, playing upon this Boston accent. Okay, so kind of a charming, funny video. But we look at all these memes right here have to do with that Bostonian accent and things that you need to do to sound more Bostonian, right? And the funny thing about some of these, though, is that the R instead of the V one, the top right one, some of those features actually have to do with what class of Bostonian you are. So if you're a lower working class, you're going to replace the R sound with a V sometimes in your language. So it's super funny. But you might practice some of those Bostonian features if you're in Boston to look like a native, right? You don't want to sound like a foreigner. So this whole covert and overt prestige thing, you develop behavioral and linguistic norms so that you can be inside whatever group that is. And if that group is using whatever dialect, you're going to speak like them to be in that dialect. If they're using standard American English, because maybe it's a workplace, you're going to try to use that to fit in that group there, okay? I'm not going to read all my memes to you. You can see them. Okay, so what is all this called? Getting to this question. By the way, if you ever see a TEA symbol in the top right, that's because I've seen this terminology on a Texas exam question. So I just put it there as a, hey, make note of this term. Specifically the term register. Now, for our purpose of this class, style shifting and register are going to be synonyms, okay? Just think of them as the same word. But when do we switch these dialects? When do we turn these features on and off? What burners am I turning up or turning down? And it has to do with your day. So here's a day here. Let's say this morning you're in class. Then at noon you went to lunch with your friend, and all of a sudden President Mong of the university walks up while you're at lunch with your friend. You leave lunch with your friend, you call your mom, and then you go to work. Okay. Throughout this whole day, in every one of these contexts, you've likely changed your language style to meet the need of that moment. So you might use maybe a more standard dialect when you're in class with me, and you're going to use some of the jargon we've discussed, right? Sociolects, regional dialects, right? But as soon as you go to lunch with your friend, you're not going to use any of those terms, okay? You're not going to raise your hand to speak to me. All the social context change. You're going to be more casual, more informal, use more of whatever dialect you and your friend share. But the moment the president walks up during lunch, right, you might sit up and shift again. Just, you're talking to the president of the university. You might want to come across in a different way to be respected, right? So throughout this whole day, you're shifting how you are and how you speak, and you're changing your register to align with the group at the moment. So you're changing your style, you're changing your register to fit in at that moment. You can literally shift moment to moment of the day, depending on who's in front of you. We'll usually shift our style to match the person that we're talking to. So when you first meet somebody new, you might innately be a little more like, okay, how's this person talking? I'm gonna try to match them. As an educator, that is a great skill, okay? But that's something that you're capable of doing. Whether you decide to do it or not is up to you. This can be the shift between informal and formal speech. So hello, how are you? And what's up, right? What's up is more informal. Hello, how are you is formal. And this can be the shift between direct and indirect speech. Let me give you an examples of that. Well, here's an example of informal and informal speech. Your mom says, have you done your homework? Teenager says, come on, why are you always bothering me about this? But your teacher can ask you the same question. It's yes, Miss Adams, I've completed all the assignments that are due for tomorrow morning, right? So these are very different styles of speaking based on who we're talking to. But let's talk about that style shifting regarding direct and indirect communication. Style shifting belongs to a field called pragmatics. So, and we talked about this in our welcome video. It's not what you say, it's how you say it. It is what the speaker really means when they said what they said, okay? So we use this example in our welcome video of, this nice haircut your friend got. We say, it looks good, right? And then we got this guy and we've got to say the same thing. But we're trying to communicate it doesn't look good. So maybe we'll say, it looks good, right? And this is a type of style shifting, deciding if we're going to use direct speech. It looks good. I mean what I say. Or indirect speech. It looks good. I know I said it looks good, but underneath it, I'm actually saying something else. So the example of style shifting. We do this all the time with the search and the commands. So what's the difference between me telling you shut the door and can you shut the door? They both ask for the same thing. Please, somebody shut the door, right? But they both literally ask for the same thing, but they ask it much differently. So if I say shut the door, that sounds like a command, right? I'm bossing you around. If I say can you shut the door, I am recognizing that I'm inconveniencing you by making this request. So I'm asking it a polite way, still hoping to get the same action from you as shut the door, right? We use this with technical vocabulary. If I'm talking to you in class, when we go into chapter 1, I'm going to talk to you about phonemes. Phonemes, phonemes, phonemes. You're going to know what that word means in that time. But if I'm not talking to someone in my class, I'm going to say the word sound. So I'm going to shift to a different terminology so that that person can understand me. And here we're going to learn it as phoneme. Field-specific phrases, so we call it African American Vernacular English and Linguistics, but the secular world might call it Ebonics, okay? So this is a shift. Depending on what word I want to use in this context is shifting to meet my audience. Empathic expressions, so think about this. Are there people in your life that you can say, oh shit to? And are there other people in your life that you have to say, oh shoot? Who can you not say, oh shit to? Okay, so you're already thinking of, okay, I wouldn't say it in front of this person, right? Because you're shifting. This is a good example of shifting your style to meet the audience. And then phrases, hello, how are you, and what's up? There's a difference there. We make all these choices for pragmatic reasons, for whatever is going to get us the most respect and admiration at that time. Style shifting has many different hats. Or style shifting in your many different hats, sorry. I had a student in the past who worked at Chick-fil-A. We were talking about our occupations and how do you style shift in your occupation. I wish we had class face-to-face because this is such a fun conversation when you guys talk about your careers. I had a young African-American girl who worked at a post office in a predominantly upscale Caucasian neighborhood in Dallas. And I loved her talking about the stories between how she would talk at home versus how she would talk to these customers, and how she had to shift her style because of the neighborhood and the employment she was in. I've had that same thing, though, with my Hispanic students working. One of them I know worked in retail. Or no, she worked at a bank, and she was talking about how when Caucasians or African Americans would come in, she would make sure she'd use English right. But if a Hispanic person came in, she'd be really careful on, does this person want English or Spanish? Never assuming, right? Because there is also this stigma sometimes in the Hispanic community of, no, I want to learn English and that's what I'm going to speak, or vice versa. So we are very careful with who we are and what we say, given these contexts. But this one student right here, the sure versus certainly, she worked at Chick-fil-A, and they literally train you as an employee there on what things you should say and what things you shouldn't say. So if a customer says, can I have some more ice cream? You say sure and not certainly. I said that wrong. You would say certainly and not sure. Don't say sure. Okay, I've got that wrong. So I would love to ask you, and I want you to think about it, what is the difference between saying certainly and saying sure? Because the reality is it's a pragmatic difference. Sure and certainly mean the same thing. Semantics, right? Semantics talks about the meaning of words. Sure and certainly mean yes. They mean yes. But pragmatically, they have very different meanings in our society. Sure means you're a little inconveniencing me, but I'll do it, right? Certainly means I am thrilled to be doing this for you and would rather do nothing else, right? Chick-fil-A, in this circumstance, has picked up on that linguistic social feature about our society, and they train their employees to say certainly instead of sure. A student sent me this meme. I may be ghetto at heart, but my customer service voice went to Harvard. Perfect example of that register style shifting. I'm just going to play this clip because it's funny. I'll just play a couple minutes of it, but you can go to the link and actually watch the whole thing if you want, because it's super funny on this in this particular skit on the pressure of linguistic expectations to get the admiration and respect or to avoid getting in trouble. So I'm going to play just a minute of it. If you want to watch the whole thing, feel free to go to the PowerPoint. So returning to this phone call, right? We watched this at the beginning of the lecture, and this is all what we were talking about at the time, which you didn't know we were talking about, was this style shifting, this changing the way you communicate based on the context so that you can fit in, right? And whatever's motivating that, the reality is you just want to look agreeable and you want to match the speaking style of who you're speaking to. And I think this clip is a perfect example of that. We want to be careful with something because you're going to watch your next lecture on Spanglish. Style shifting is different than code switching. In mainstream English classes or university, they use the word code switching to mean what I'm talking about with register or style shifting, right? Changing the way you speak at any given time. In linguistics, it's a very different concept. So style shifting is when you are changing the dialect of English you're using to fit into a language, okay? Again, we're just talking about English right now, but this could apply to anything. Style shifting is when you're using the same language, but shifting the dialect you're using to fit into that situation. Remember, the difference between a language and a dialect is that people with different dialects can still communicate with each other. Code switching is very different. Code switching is when you're changing full languages, okay? So you're changing from English to Spanish in the same conversation, but you're changing, you're code switching, meaning you're reaching for two different languages. That's different than style shifting. So I have an example of code switching there at the bottom, but I'm going to show you a little bit more of that in the next lecture on Spanglish.